Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this rainy Friday. The audience in person online, I'm Treille, I'm the founding director of the Center for Design that is hosting this Design Research Week, and this is the last day. And I think we couldn't have a better start than discussing about form, aesthetics, and design. So I think that's pretty fun. So I'm sure that this will be just another very important moment for us to share what's happening in design these days. Thank you, Nathan, Felde, for assembling. That's couldn't be more interdisciplinary probably, but so thank you very much. And I just let's stage to you to introduce the guests.
Thank you. I'm David Felde, professor of design here in the College of Arts, Media and Design. And this conversation with you was a long time in developing. I think it probably began when I met you at Gioia, Laura Iannilli, and it kind of clicked when I met Simon.
Don't say that.
Yeah, that's when it all clicked. Yeah. Anyway, setting you up. But the nexus of all this is form, and form is so central to the concerns of designers as well. Essentially, where we started, where we end, form in all of its forms. And Gioia will elucidate more about the nature of those forms as well. I've been reading a few things lately that also contributed to my interest in bringing this together. One is, well, of course, human nature and conduct, which came about from my reading through discussions with Gioia, whose philosophy is sort of founded in those ideas of pragmatism, and John Dewey in particular. I should also mention had a hand in philosophically bringing together Black Mountain College in the U.S. So it's a very, very significant author whose work you should know, John Dewey, especially those of you, some of whom are studying experience design. It's nothing more fundamental to experience design than what we're talking about here. And in this book, he breaks it into three sections: habit, impulse, and intelligence. An interesting little triad there. So we can see how intelligence, the intelligent response to uncertainty, the kind of a great way to deal with this should I or should I not question that's in front of people all day long. And then the other book I want to mention is Mackenzie Wark's Sensoria, which breaks down into three sections where he's commenting on the writing of others in a very brilliant way. But he talks about aesthetics, talks about ethnographics, and he talks about techniques, which is for Mackenzie equivalent of design. So those two triads kind of frame some of the things we're going to talk about today. But the essential text is a book I came across in the late 70s, first edition, but a subsequent edition in 1979 called Laws of Form by G. Spencer Brown. There's a statement at the beginning which I think should crystallize some of our ideas about form, and it goes like this: we take as given the idea of a distinction, the idea of indication, and that we cannot make an indication without drawing a distinction. We take, therefore, the form of distinction for the form. So with that as our preface going into this, is kind of a open concept statement. I'll introduce Gioia Laura Iannilli, who has come all the way from the University of Bologna, who has, despite the weather, despite how horrible air travel is these days, and made her way here to elucidate this matter of form, design, in particular with regard to everyday life. something that needs a lot of attention from us. And also say, I'm invoking the wisdom of philosophy at this point, because I think we're at a very critical point with regard to the design practice, if not for reasons of artificial intelligence, also for the kind of disruptive nature of life on the planet these days, and the need for us to think carefully about the why, how, and wherefore of design, which has contributed to some of the problems and contributed to some of the opportunities that have been created over the last, say, 100 years. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gioia to take us through her thoughts on form and design. Thank you, Gioia.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It is a great opportunity for me to talk to, let's say, a very operative kind of audience, being here, designers and practitioners of what theoretically I basically try to, make explicit in my research. Before starting, a little bit of background, which sorts of leads to this question I'm raising here. So I have a quite hybrid background, spanning philosophy, art history, architecture, philosophy again, and social sciences. And aesthetics has always been, the sort of milieu in which all my research has been carried out. But the audiences that while I was studying, I had to deal with were both interdisciplinary or non-aesthetic, so philosophical, but not necessarily concerned with aesthetic matters. So I really had to clarify what I was doing. But the most important part comes when I started to teach. And I started to teach to design, fashion, and architecture students. Super bright students who sometimes had to, attend my classes because they were mandatory, compulsory classes. At other times, they, freely chose to attend my classes. But, sometimes I could see, them following what I was saying. So being interested in finding words or concepts for what they were concretely doing. But sometimes they also looked a bit frustrated because, one time a person told me, sure, great, you're using these, big words, concept, but concretely, what's the point of all this, right? And that really made me, rethink the way I approach my discipline, aesthetics, philosophical aesthetics, and design. Especially design students have been a great, audience for me to develop a specific way of thinking aesthetics, of clarifying to myself what aesthetics is for. So I owe a whole lot to design students and this kind of environments. And so today I'm sort of, wondering whether as a, aesthetician, I can be of any use to design. More generally, let's be more impersonal. Can philosophical aesthetics be of any use to design? So I would like to give back somehow, to design that has been so useful to me and to the discipline as a whole, that sometimes, has been way too, dwelling too much on too traditional categories, dusty old categories, which nowadays do not apply anymore. And, that's basically the background and what led me to ask this kind of question. But now I would like to ask you a question. Don't be shy, because really there are no wrong answers here. So what do you think we're talking about when we talk about aesthetics? What aesthetics to you? Please don't be shy. This is the worst part, when you really have to, take words out of your mouth with,
One word that comes to mind is beauty.
Sure. Taste, great. Well, yeah.
Visual forms of representing anything.
Okay, so visual aspects of experience representation. Sure. Anything else?
Feelings.
Feelings, sure. Team. You mean team?
Like a step up with.
Okay, yeah, okay, yeah. Something else? Well, usually over the years also art has been associated with, you know, with aesthetics, unless there are other contributions. Okay, these are all correct answers. There are many ways to talk about aesthetics and not just one way. And that's the main point to rethink what aesthetics is, but we'll get back to that. So even though it is true that there are many ways to talk about, you know, aesthetics, it also, I think that the anything goes principle should not be applied to anything. So we do need some kind of, I don't want to say normativity, but it's at least, you know, some kind of structure to understand what it is that we're talking about when we talk about aesthetics. And I'd say there are two main ways to understand what's aesthetics. On the one hand, an academic thematic aesthetics. So what's done in academia? So what's done in classrooms? What's done in books? So the first book you see is Aesthetica, which is basically the first book written at the second half of the 18th century by this Baumgarten guy, a German philosopher, who basically coined the word aesthetics and attached it to a philosophical discipline. So that's just a symbolic way of talking about academic thematic aesthetics. So when a discipline makes certain practices thematic, so then it makes them explicit, a theme of discussion, basically. And on the other hand, we have what you guys basically do, or what we do in our everyday lives. So practical operative aesthetics through our taste choices, through our, you know, anything really we do every day that is carried out through our senses, our perceptual level of experience, and what we express. So sensibility, perception, and expressiveness are all part of what aesthetics is, and that is carried out practically, operatively, concretely, basically. And the second image you see is basically it's the same thing, but it's a magazine, you know, that is concerned with lifestyle, design practices, art practices, and so forth. So it was a nice, you know, let's say it complements well what, you know, Baumgarten with academic and more formal, you know, with a more formal style did with this book. So to sort of answer my previous question, so aesthetics exist in the plural. So the kind of understanding of aesthetics I have is a pluralistic kind of understanding. And this might seem trivial nowadays to talk about that, because we do know that aesthetics is all that, and it's not just this or that. But it's been the case for a long time in aesthetics, in philosophical aesthetics, that aesthetics have been, let's say, butchered down to certain things, to certain concepts. And here's, I don't know if you can see everything, maybe, thank you very much. But this is a very brief history of aesthetics. As I was saying, this guy Baumgarten in the 18th century coined, or, you know, defined aesthetics as a science of sensory cognition, or as a cognitio inferior. So still a knowledge, some kind of knowledge, but inferior, precisely because it was linked to the body, to our senses. So again, there's a sort of hierarchy that is at stake in this case. And it comes from the Greek word aesthesis, which, as you can see, it just means perception through the senses. So it's a very liberal understanding of aesthetics, which doesn't necessarily have to do with art. Yet over the, you know, over the centuries, aesthetics has been conflated to either a philosophy of art, towards which we should be disinterested, so not using them, basically not interacting concretely with them, and that should be defined blind. So positive and exceptional kind of concepts. So aesthetics has always been linked to museums on Sundays because, you know, it's the time where we can actually carry out all those activities that during the working week we can't. Or that's something.
Could you argue that, is it saying that the aesthetics are over there and not here?
Exactly, it's something that it's for our contemplation. So it's something we can observe, basically, and also vision has always been the most important sense involved in aesthetic evaluation or hearing. So not, you know, sake. Yet there's over the past few years, especially within everyday aesthetics, which is a subdiscipline of aesthetics concerned with everyday practices and their aesthetic import, something different has been outlined. Usually, when we talk about traditional aesthetics, we talk about necessary and sufficient conditions or properties that should be defined and listed, and if all the the boxes are checked, basically, okay, we have something beautiful. So it's a very strict kind of an analytical kind of approach. Yet this guy, Ostina Karina, was a great colleague of mine from the university in Finland. Instead of properties, talked about indicators, almost symptoms of the aesthetic, meaning that if these things are at stake in a certain and they can change, they can manifest themselves with different kind of degrees of intensity, we might say that we are in an aesthetic sort of situation. So the first indicator is a first-hand experience in situation. When we experience aesthetically, we experience something firsthand, so we cannot delegate to someone else our experience. And our senses, our whole multisensorial, toolkit is at stake, and we're always in a situation, so we're not detached from something. It's an immersive kind of experience. Then emotions. So someone mentioned feelings before. When we are experiencing something firsthand and in situation, that interaction might resonate positively or negatively. So this is a very, short version of, an aesthetics of emotions. And that's a very, it's a more complex thing to talk about. As far as the aesthetic is concerned, some kind of judgment is always at stake. But these judgments can be both verbal, propositional, or non-verbal, behavioral. So what we choose to do, to buy, to go see, or what we do not. Or maybe we can just express something. So I like this vest. This is a judgment of taste towards this vest. But there was a great philosopher, Wittgenstein, who said, if I like a dress, maybe I will just wear it as much as I can. And that's also judgment of taste. But it's a non-propositional one. It's a non-verbal one. And if these judgments are verbal, they can be, if these judgments are verbal, but it's not necessary that judgments of taste have to be verbal. We do use a special vocabulary. So we would use a certain kind of, adjectives. And aesthetic properties is a big topic in aesthetics in order to say that we appreciate something aesthetically. But we should distinguish a special vocabulary from a specialistic one. Why? Because for a long time, the, let's say, people who are recognized having the competence to judge something aesthetically were critics. And hence people who had a specialistic kind of, lexicon, or vocabulary they could use. As far as everyday life is concerned, we do not need to have that specialistic kind of skills. We do have some kind of competence or intelligence, as Nathan was saying via Dewey, but it's a different kind of expertise, which is still an aesthetic one. So again, things sort of run on a spectrum, and it's not either these or that. It's not black and white, so to speak. And also there's a tacit level of the aesthetic, meaning that the context in which we carry out our experiences are really important, precisely because there we learn how to deal with things also socially. And usually it's these uncodified rules that we acquire in the context in which we grow up that can regulate tacitly. So that's the normativity of the aesthetic, so to speak. And they can also change over time as we change context, as we move somewhere else, for instance, and hence sort of make, our context function. So we might also talk about an aesthetic function of this tacit aspect of aesthetics. And if all this is true, aesthetics has to do also, so not, alternatively, with non-art. So non-natural aspects of experience. We were talking about AI, we were talking about the digital import of our current experiences, and hence immersion, interest, relation are crucial concepts to aesthetic nowadays. And so also different categories from beauty are at stake, and that's also non-exceptional. Ordinary experiences are at stake as far as the aesthetic is concerned, if it is true that these indicators can sort of frame aesthetics per se. And here I've just listed a series of oppositional, couplets, which have, sort of characterized traditional aesthetics. And aesthetics traditionally characterized by a tendentially vertical and oppositional view of the aesthetic, which was reduced to the artistic. And so a hierarchical sort of approach to things. So there's like the opposition between a subject and an object. Subject meant either as a genius, a creator who, creates something out of nowhere, precisely because he or she is a genius, versus a passive spectator. We can only be passive spectators if it is true that there's a genius creator on the other hand. And then objects. So disinterest, interest, beautiful, useful from function, which are crucial couplets within an aesthetics of design specifically. Conservation and consumption. You can think about how preservation in architecture or in art is at stake, or has been at stake for a long time, and now maybe this idea of consuming things is also at stake. Natural, artificial, highbrow, lowbrow, extraordinary, ordinary, thematic or explicit, operative or implicit aesthetics, which are both important. This idea of a continuism, so being on spectra rather than on discontinuous sort of series of I always use the example of the Pantone sort of catalog versus a spectrum with internally graded, so to speak. So I think that's the way we should go, having in mind this continuism rather than discontinuism, and also the idea that if it is true that even our consumption choices every day have are guided by aesthetic principles or our taste. As a matter of fact, they also have ethical implications. And hence, this opposition between ethics and aesthetics, perhaps, is no longer the case. But I would like to focus more on the form function couplet, precisely because, it's a crucial topic in today's panel, but also because it sort of summarizes, what has been at stake for a long time in aesthetics. And nowadays, this, even though there are still philosophers who think that aesthetics is all about form, and use should not be even mentioned aesthetics, because we should be, disinterested in what we deal with. We should just contemplate and enjoy to the point of being sort of hedonistically, dealing with things in our everyday life. We should be, sort of constellated with beautiful things. Well, that's just not, realistic at all. aesthetics can be that, but it's not just that. So it also concerns the usage of things, the fact that things can be useful to us and hence also gratifying. So having a positive impact on our lives and on our society. And so we can consume things. I'm not talking about consumerism, as you can see from there. Consumption is a more, let's say, liberal word to use. And then, of course, things are also tools to us. And that does not mean that they're not aesthetic as such. So Nathan mentioned the fact that everydayness is nowadays a topic in aesthetics, and that's true, but that's not the only subdiscipline that has surfaced over the last few years in aesthetics. And all the disciplines or subdisciplines, subfields of aesthetics you can see listed there do provide a more horizontal and inclusive view of the aesthetic today, which is not buttered down to the artistic, but includes way more things than before. So we have environmental aesthetics, non-Western aesthetics, which has brought to the table a great deal of inclusivity, precisely because, for instance, some non-Western cultures do not have a word for beauty. Or perhaps they do not distinguish all those couplets we've distinguished before, because everything conflicts in everyday practices. For instance, then urban aesthetics, and of course, everyday aesthetics and design aesthetics, which has been a very late addition to aesthetics, even though other disciplines such as, for instance, semiotics or cultural studies had, dealt with with design.
Really ironic.
It is, and it's so frustrating. It is. So it's a very recent addition, but bottom line, theory cannot be detached from experience. So again, that continuism that I try to, sort of reproduce with that ugly double-headed arrow that I agree with it there. Okay, so this is a little bit the framework in which I've been, sort of building a new way to teach aesthetics and also explain aesthetics to my colleagues. And hence, that's why I am so much grateful to design, because it's been a crucial agent for a reconceptualization of aesthetics. So every time design, and maybe that's why it took so long philosopher to include design, perhaps in their research, because it's a dangerous tool. It's a dangerous device because it messed everything up. The traditional way of understanding aesthetics. So, for instance, one question that can be raised is aesthetic about contemplation or use? And this is a rhetorical question, of course. Can we still think of it in terms of an opposition between form and function? Does it concern objects or experiences, or both? Of course, both, because we can have a focus on the single item, but experience design is one of the greatest developments of design of the past few years. And of course, it also means that aesthetics perhaps should not be considered any longer as a philosophy concerned with beauty or art. Precisely because there are also non-art, and non-art can be anything, really phenomenon. And also the fact that aesthetics can have a concrete effect on our environment and on our society. But one of the most important questions, what's the point of aesthetics? What's the function of aesthetics? And hopefully, I'm not providing a concrete answer, but I hope that some of the things that I'll say will sort of resonate with you. And the three dots at the end of the list, maybe you can fill that up, maybe in the Q&A. Am I taking too much time? Okay. Another thing that I would like to do, is asking you to be patient as far as philosophy is concerned, and especially aesthetics, which is my field of interest. hopefully not. But as far as humanities go, you know, slowness. It's right here, right now. But sometimes also finding the right solution takes transversal ways. It's not like a straightforward kind of effort. And hence, these are two philosophers which are really dear to me, especially John Dewey, precisely because almost surprisingly in the 30s and in the 60s, they both talked about design in a way that these are the references that I'm giving you if you want to read this text. And if you can read German, I don't know if you can, but the German version of Adorno's text is way better. The English translation is not really good, but you know, it's just a suggestion.
And that's not an aesthetic judgment.
That's also an aesthetic judgment. Let's say so. It doesn't resonate with me. Okay. But you know, humanities are also characterized by some sort of slowness. So you really have to go through things. And it's also a very frustrating effort, but I think it's a good exercise to, you know, sort of dialectically deal with things. So the two texts that I would recommend reading are chapter 6 from Artist Experience, devoted to the question of substance and form. And you can, you know, replace substance with function, because basically at some point Dewey talks explicitly about design and talks about the relationship between form and function. And then there's it was a conference Adorno gave in 1965 at the Deutsche Fachbund, so specialistic kind of environment where he talked about functionalism today. And they both use design as a case study. They both had an anti-dualistic or dialectical understanding of the relationship between form and function. And they both went against the two extreme of mere formalism on the one hand and orthodox functionalism on the other. And especially Adorno's was, you know, the target they both had. The idea of an efficacy versus an efficiency. So being able to solve things straightforwardly, efficiently, and without any waste of energies. And on the other hand, efficacy. So, you know, reaching a goal, accomplishing a task, but with a little bit of dispersion of energies, which is still at stake when we actually do things. We're not completely efficient beings per se. And that's why form and function are, you know, interconnected, and it's not just functionality and not just pure formalism. They both had these allergy towards any idea of a pre-established criterion or criteria in aesthetics, but things emerge within relationships. They do not pre-exist any context, and that's very important. They involve in their works the point of view both of producers and users. So it's, you know, there's not like a genius understanding of producers, but there are different degrees of competencies which can also entail users, and it's always a dialogue. It's never a monologue. So that's why they're truly relational philosophers. They both aimed at restructuring traditional aesthetics by putting forward this nexus between theory and practice. They both tackled this idea of a tension between measurable and non-measurable, quantitative and qualitative aspects of experience, and also this idea that things should not be just generalized, but we should still care or be concerned about singularity. And finally, the main goal they had is the achievement of a better life quality. Can you guys tell me how much time I have left, just to be sure?
As much as you want.
Oh my God, okay.
Keep-
And then,
The more you talk, the less I have.
okay, great. But, okay, now I just want to make sure. And do you guys have any questions? Is something unclear? Or would you like me to clarify something?
I have a question, but
Yeah.
I'll let you wanna continue?
No, I think it's better if we
Okay.
create a little bit of a.
I also graduated from the experience design master degree here, so it's very interesting to see how you're describing aesthetics and its role in design and experience design especially. We studied Dewey as well, so it's not unfamiliar. I'm really curious about your take on that particular point between individualistic kind of perception of aesthetics and the social phenomenon that sometimes experience designers have to kind of take into account. I don't know if I'm explaining the question correctly, but like more about that distinction between that subjective, it's subjective also. So the subjectivity that comes into play at an individual level and then a potential social phenomenon that then designers have to take into account.
The question is good.
Okay.
Thank you. So we do our idiosyncrasies, our personal tastes, and that's for sure. But we are not as isolated as we think. So even our personal taste is shaped by the interactions we have in our social world. And I think that sort of balances out this idea of taste as something completely subjective, because I don't think that's the case, even though we do have our, inclinations and stuff like that. And so in this sense, I also think that as far as this link between individual and society via aesthetics is concerned, it is also true that we have a duty, especially nowadays, to not just to rely on our subjective kind of side, but also see things in the bigger picture. And maybe that's, I'm not a designer, of course, but perhaps this could also mean something in terms of designing something for someone sort of oscillating between various. It's not easy. I mean, it would be just easier to just proceed through conventionality and schemes, but as I was saying there are not always pre-established criteria. There's no pure idea of what's function, what's form.
Right.
You really need to. It's also a trial and error kind of effort. So that's why we're not just efficient.
Yeah, and then I was going to throw in like cultures and subcultures, right? How does that play into all these conversations?
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of the distinction between habit and impulse, that our habits are formed aggregate over time. Our habits, they inform a behavior, but it's always checked socially, right? On one hand, you decide to wear a silly hat to work on the effect. And you use the feedback from that effect to adjust your choices over time. Should I or should I not do this? And the social context is very important because we're very sensitive to how we are being judged constantly. Presentation of self in everyday life includes attention to vigilance to or ignorance. I mean, technically an idiot doesn't care because they have constructed their own world. In Dostoevsky's idiot. No, not myself. But in some sense, we are a little bit like idiots in how we make some of our choices, and then we get, of course, corrected by that socially, how we interact with other people, how they respond to us. So it's really about the effect rather than the intention. So my intention was thus, I don't know why I did it, but the reactions to that will shape my choice in the future. I think let's say this progressive.
Yes, there are like feedback loops that sort of inform the way we perceive, and also this there's a, a concept that for a long time has been seen as shallow or negative, also in aesthetics, which is appearance. We think about appearance as something that has to do with just, superficial, and even that's why also fashion hasn't been included for a long time in aesthetics. But actually, if you think about it, appearances are exactly the way we orientate ourselves in our everyday world. So they're both form and function, together. So, and they also, sort of have to do with our identities, both individual and social. So they're, far from being like a shallow or negative
If we
thing.
think of
Yeah.
how we observe appearances, you have to think also that our visual apparatus, the way we perceive the world through our eyes, according to Chaplin, would be said, is a part of our locomotion. Your eyes move, but so does your neck, and so do your limbs. That you are constantly moving, right? With a fundamental sense of zone of safety. So there's a fundamental underneath that. Is this safe? Do I feel safe? Do I feel perceived? Do I feel heard? This is a constant feedback going on with all of your senses, and your entire central nervous system is devoted to that, right? Very little, as Lisa Barrett would point out, very little of your brain is organized to think. We reserve that for philosophers. Most of us are pretty much under remote control from a variety of sources, shaped by our environment, shaped social environment. And architects know these environments shape our behavior as well. Even the furnishing of the room created a certain kind of behavior. I don't know why I'm here, you're there. It's not the best, but it's kind of what we compromise to. It's a consensus we got to about the accoutrements of the building is how they affect each of us. Is your chair comfortable? So that brings up to me from a design point of view, this sort of mass consumption industrial approach to design was about the economics of finding the chair everyone wants. The international style is like the best fork on earth. This is the fork. This drive to converge around an ideal form really kind of make the archetype come true. So we are manipulated by them as well to believe that this is what we should do. You should do this. So therefore, most of the messages we receive are injunctive about our behavior. So form and behavior come to us not only in the shape of things that shape the way we act and behave in the world, but the injunctions that come with those. We hear words. We have conversations in our head about should I or should I not? Should I wear this hat today or not?
At the implicit level we were talking about that regulates, context. It's basically what Nathan is also talking about. Yeah, here I'm just gonna leave this in the background because it's a lot of information, but it is worth at least mentioning that the philosophers such Adorno, who was, pro great autonomous art as something absolute, and that in the 60s especially was contaminated, functionalized and commodified by, certain, by the market and everything else. If he took the time to go through design as a case study, which in the end he considered as positive, maybe also designers can take the time to go through a philosophical text and perhaps pinpoint some of the aspects that might be, of any use for your practice. He had a radically dialectical, historical, and materialistic. And so form and materials are really at stake as far as Adorno is concerned, because he also talks about not just the concrete materials that can or should not be used, or that are not proper to the aesthetic. They're not like noble high materials, which are proper to aesthetics, but even plastic, he was in the 60s. He talks about also plastic as a material that can be at stake as far as design is concerned, but he also talks about the material reality, the concrete historical context in which in the background, but when he gave this speech, he was but he was talking to architects, he was talking to designers, and it is really interesting to see how and these are a few couplets that he addressed very thoroughly in this very tough essay to read. So useful, useless, necessary, superfluous, autonomy, heteronomy, imagination, handicraft, function, ornament, need, desire, and so forth. And the collection in which these essay was initially included was titled On a Light Field, which means without model. So in an epoch in which there are no standards, there are no, categories of definitions and models of reference, what are we supposed to do? And the answer he gave, it's not like we have something we could apply or superimpose like top down nor bottom up. But we must find our criteria and our ways to deal with reality within material reality, with all of its contradictions, with all of its polarizations and paradoxes, which must be managed dynamically. And so functionality is immanent, so it's inherent within this field of forces, as he says. And I would just like to show you these quotations because I think they're really proper to the context. And he started his conference, and the blue parts are parts of the translation I modified because they look really bad. Like they didn't really, explain what he was saying in German. I know how suspect the word aesthetic must sound to you. You think perhaps of professors who, with their eyes raised to heaven, spew forth formalistic laws of eternal and everlasting beauty.
That probably happened.
Yeah, and probably it's still happening. But and he wrote this in the 60s. So it's like history repeating itself, which are no more than recipes for the production of ephemeral classicistic kitsch. So it uses the word kitsch, which is quite rough in this context, and especially in the context of the Deutsche Werkbund. In fact, the opposite must be the case in true aesthetics. If aesthetics continued academically without the most ruthless self-criticism, it would already be condemned. Aesthetics, as an integral facet of philosophy, awaits a new impulse, which must come from reflective efforts. And he also talks about aesthetics as a practical necessity, not just as an abstract, idealistic way of dealing with things. And it becomes so once it becomes clear that concepts like usefulness and uselessness in art, like the separation of autonomous, so like disinterested kind of art, and purpose-oriented art, imagination, and ornament must once again be discussed. Okay, beauty today. So he uses these classic concepts in aesthetics, but in almost a paradoxical way. So he talks about something that everybody can agree on, even though it is not the only way we have talked about aesthetics. For instance, Dewey always use quotation marks when he talks about beauty. It's like an elephant concept. Then we say philosophers, okay? Beauty today can have no other measure except that to which a work resolves contradictions. A work must cut through the contradiction and overcome them, not by covering them up, but by pursuing them. And that's why a critical theorist, as Adorno, against commodification, against mass production, and so forth, actually dealt with the contradictory, nature and material reality he was living in. Mere formal beauty, whatever that might be, is empty and meaningless. Beauty is either the resultant of force vectors, or it is nothing at all. So it is actually a dialectical concept. It's not just a simple recipe we have to do things. And the same goes with function. And so he talks about a modified aesthetics, and then I'm gonna just show you a couple of quotations from him and Dewey, and then I'm done because there are too many words on the screen, and I apologize for that. But I just wanted to bring you the concrete, material from these two philosophers. A modified aesthetics would outline its own object with increasing clarity as it would begin to feel more intensely the need to investigate it. like traditional aesthetics, it would not necessarily view the concept of art as its given correlate. And again, this is an advocate for autonomous art. So it's a very important passage. Aesthetic thought today must surpass art by thinking art. It would thereby surpass the current opposition of purposeful and purpose-free. So, form and function, basically, under which the producer must suffer as much as the observer. So I was saying both sides must be taken into consideration. So aesthetics must take into consideration, and also design, I think, field, so society, current society, but also its own academic field. In the case of aesthetics, which has been employing outdated category. So it needs to modify itself, basically. I would just like to bring your attention to the last quotation, where it says, therefore, there is no chemically pure purposefulness set up as the opposite of the purpose-free aesthetic. So there is no pre-constituted or perfect idea of what is functional, and the same goes with form. So there's a field of tension and a sublimation. So what emerges from this field of tensions, which is our current society, that's form function. There is no pre-constituted idea of both, of either, actually. So even the most pure forms of purpose are nourished by ideas, which are in fact derived from artistic experience. No form can be said to be determined exhaustively by its purpose. So it's not like form follows function. And also he is against this orthodox understanding of functionalism that Adolf Loos had, and especially in Ornament as Crime. He said, the evolution of culture is synonymous with removal of ornament from objects of daily use. And that's the exact opposite of pure formalism. And it's equally wrong. So that's the point of Adorno. And I will just show you a quotation from Dewey, which maybe, we can see how close to Adorno. So Dewey was a pragmatist philosopher. Pragmatism has been a quite important current of thought in America, especially. And the golden rule of pragmatism was that any theory, any theorization, any conceptualization must find its root and test bed in experience. And so there's a sort of circularity. Philosophers cannot just detach themselves and be in an ivory tower, looking over society. But anything must come from society and go back there. That's the kind of functional aesthetics that maybe we could talk about. And just to close my speech, because I've been talking way too much, it says something very similar to what Adorno said. There is no pre-established harmony, so no chemically pure idea of, that guarantees that what satisfies the needs of one set of organs will fulfill that of all the other structures and needs that have part in the experience, so as to bring it to completion as a complex of all elements. So he had this very organic idea of experience, which includes the biological nervous apparatus, which is a system of functions, and then also social aspects. So from, let's say, from the neuron to the city, we might say. And hence, aesthetics, just like Adorno would say, should go beyond conventionality. And maybe that's the same for design, or architecture, which still has to start somewhere. So conventions are also useful. But it should also go beyond that, precisely because if we rely too much on conventions and on pre-constituted formulas, we tend to generalize too much. And so we lose individuality and otherness, which is crucial anytime we do something, the other. And that's a dynamic, dialectical kind of effort. And then he says, all we can say is that in the absence of disturbing context, those that are perhaps designed or, planned by architecture as well, and design. In the absence of disturbing context of efficiency to a certain extent, a balance tends to be struck so that objects will be satisfactory. So E juxtaposes satisfaction and usefulness. So as you can see, form function go together. Satisfactory, useful in the strict sense to the self as a whole, not just as an individual, as a subject, but as someone who's in a society and is a relational being, even though some specific efficiency be sacrificed in the process. So that contraposition between efficiency and efficacy we were talking about before. And so usefulness is not meant here in the utilitarian capitalistic sense. And at the same time, satisfaction is not meant as mere hedonism, so just mere pleasure. So there is a balance that should be struck at some point through the development of competencies in this framework. And I think that perhaps we might say that according to Dewey, form is not thought in connection with a single object. So form is not something that should pertain exclusively to a single object as designed, but the form is talking about is the form of an experience. So of an interaction between perhaps an individual and an object, an individual and a room, a society, an environment, and so forth. And the form of an experience that works, that functions, but where things fit and resonate positively, hopefully. And here there's a little bit of a analysis I made of the relationship between form and function as provided by Dewey in this chapter. And as you can see, I used the spectrum idea there, and you can see the extremes, the negative extremes on the left. So form meant as mere shape. So shapes and things that can be just juxtaposed one to the other, just, sort of entails an embellished idea of form in aesthetics, superficial idea. On the other hand, if we think of function as a mere mechanism, like, laws even thought of, and so we just have an orthodox functionalism in which perhaps the pleasurable aspects of experience, the gratifying aspects of experience are not taken into consideration. While on the other hand, these are just the concepts used in order to reconfigure this idea of the relationship between form and function. You have a configuration, which is a more organic way of understanding form in terms of a relationship between an individual and an environment. And in terms of function, he talks about consummation. Consummation is the specific technical term. If you ever read artist experience, you know that. It talks about aesthetic experience as an experience that is consummated, meaning that is fully rounded out. It has been, it defines it as an experience, so with a distinctive character in which all the nexuses, which philosophy does naturally, disjointed over the centuries, are sort of reinvented. And hence also for Dewey, this relationship between form and function must be dialectical, must be dynamic, must be organic, and not, sort of separated. Yeah.
Is this
So-
from Dewey?
Pardon?
The diagram is from Dewey.
I did it, but it's the book I was talking about yesterday. I derived it from this sixth chapter of artists as experience. Absolutely, yeah. And that would be all. Thank you very much for.
Thank you. That's a lot of territory. Looking for an epiphany on your part with regard to aesthetics, the terminology, the language. This one, you had a question?
Yeah, so, part of me really wants to talk about, there's this new government agency which ends in the word efficiency, and I think we talk about that, but I think we need drinks. So I'm gonna leave that on the table.
Maybe.
Yeah. But you were talking about the relationship between form and function, and at one point you said the word gratifying, and it kind of surprised me because you kind of put it on the side of function. But I feel like because it's a spectrum, all these words go back and forth, and so gratification and gratifying in the interplay between form and function, because I think as people that are thinking about aesthetic features of the world and experiences broadly, that comes into play. Like, when does gratifying occur, and what does that mean?
It's related to satisfying.
Yeah.
It's
yeah,
also part of consummation.
Yeah.
So I think it's in that little nest of terminology.
yeah, I mean, they all Pittsburgh question, but yeah, they all belong to the same, let's say, warm side of the spectrum, let's say. And as far as the aesthetic is concerned, we're talking about humans experiencing something through their senses, their perception. As I was saying, it's an axis between sensing, perceiving, and expressing. And as far as the aesthetic is concerned, a degree of, gratification, satisfaction, pleasure must be at stake. And this is something that maybe it's a transversal answer I'm giving, so bear with me. But this is something we were talking about yesterday as well. Aesthetic footprint instead of ecological footprint. So we do have this idea of an ecological footprint, which is measurable, which can be understood cognitively with, our brains. And so we know that if we consume this amount of X product, that will have an impact on something. That's true. So we can act accordingly, but that's the cognitive understanding. On the other hand, we must be, sort of also aware of the fact, I mean, as designers, as policymakers, that when we are, talking about human experiences, these positive aspects of experience of pleasure, taste, personal, also, likings or gratification must also be at stake. So it is not enough to cognitively understand that that number means that if I do that, I will damage something else. So this guy has, and actually it's the same guy who formulated the indicators of the aesthetic thingy. He also said, sure, but how about aesthetic experiences? How about we take also into consideration the sort of, let's say, sensory aspect of our experience? So this means that also when we talk about policy, we need to take into consideration the gratification aspect, because people would more likely do things if also that aspect is taken into consideration and not just a quantification of damage is at stake. So we also should rely on sensibility, on taste, on playfulness even, which is still part of this positive warmer spectrum of experience, even when, more serious things such as climate change or environmental issues are at stake. So it's a transversal answer, because it's, it's really hard to have a straightforward answer to that. But as far as aesthetic is concerned, some kind of, positive resonating with what you're doing must be at stake. Otherwise, it's not aesthetic. But there's no pre-established, sort of explanation of what pleasure is. And for instance, the example I sometimes give to my students is, think of escape rooms. They are frustrating experiences for sure, but still people go there and enjoy that kind of negative experience precisely because there is some sort of articulation of the experience which is still positive, even if it's negative at the same time. And then we have masochism, which I guess is the most striking example of how pleasure is not necessarily something positive, but still must be at stake insofar as this sensing, perceiving, expressing nexus is at stake.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's another question.
I want to introduce our special guest as well, the mix. What we did intentionally, was conceive of this as kind of an intersection, maybe a collision of perspective, from multiple perspectives. I met Simon at the last semester finals, or for the master part. And of all the presentations, half of which I had no concept of what was actually being discussed. It was in a language completely foreign to me. But the presentation by Simon was about philosophy and mathematics, so philosophy of mathematics. And it intrigued me enough, and I hope I followed enough of it to make some sense of it. But following his presentation, spoke with him about something that's fascinated me for a long time, which is T. Spencer Brown's laws of form.
Just noticed the difference in the copies.
Can you show it?
Mine's got a little Greek on it.
Maybe
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. His is also a little older.
But both of them have the mandatory Chinese inscription here, which is been consistently on page 0 and refers to the void, blind void, which there's nothing, the formlessness. And so both the form and function, the distinction, the compilation of the two, and the dynamic relationship of them, in fact, subsuming themselves into each other, a kind of a Ouroboros approach. But now Simon is going to give us a bit of an introduction, not only to this concept of laws of form, where he begins with this idea of a distinction and what a distinction and indication are with regard to each other. This I look at as sort of the atomic, almost subatomic level of things we see in permutations of shape in everything that we do. These multiple, infinite, fractal in some sense, forms that come to us in the material world, and then beyond the material world into the invisible world, where we use our imagination to conjure form that represents concepts that are not material as well. So things that are figments of our imagination or our memory, or sort of, and always refer, as Bergson would say, as a reference between the matter and memory. History / experience. So Simon, if you will, take us into this and lead us into the thicket of Luke Kaufman's topology, not theory, or where we like to go with this, but I want you to find a comfortable place within this uncomfortable world of thinking about form in a completely different way than you're probably used to coming to design as a business.
Briefly, I was at Northeastern for 2.5 years. I graduated in December. I did my capstone presentation on kind of juxtaposing what I defined as mathematics versus math. Bear with me here while I get my iPad on the TV. Let's see here. So I kind of just described it as saying mathematics is this like 3-dimensional sphere of knowledge that an alien civilization would hypothetically also have. And then there's this like the projection of it, or this view of it, which would be a sphere, a disk, and this is what I call math, which is our interpretation of that knowledge. But in conversations with Nathan, in my research, in literally the 3 or 4 books I'm like reading at the time.
Old school.
Oh yeah.
Books.
I realized everything is just about juxtapositions and distinctions, which is exactly what George Spencer Brown talks about in his book. You know, I made a distinction between math and mathematics. Here, I've got a Malcolm Gladwell quote somewhere as well. I've got a Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. It's all about distinctions and differencing yourself from some other. But so in George Spencer Brown's work, you have this idea of a blank space. And he wants to make a distinction on this blank space. The way he chooses to do it is he just makes a circle. So a circle is a collection of points that are equidistant from some center point, if you want to get a little math nerdy into it. But so what it does is it distinguishes an interior from an exterior. And this distinction is kind of the basis of the book in some way. I don't even really fully understand this book, to be honest. I don't think it's a stretch to say you don't either.
I don't need,
It's a lot of gibberish. Somebody, a guy named Bertrand Russell, described it as important as Euclid's Elements. Sure, go for it. I don't know if it's comprehensible enough to be that impactful. But in this form of a distinction, he comes up with this notation where you have some element, we'll call it A, and if you put this little box around it, it's, how would you even describe it? Is it now not A? Is it just something different from A?
it's distinct from, it's the
Yeah.
arc of distinction,
Yeah.
and which is at the same time the indication. So just as Gioia spoke to us about this distinction we have been making traditionally and classically between form and function, this form and this function. In some respects, you could say, you know, you can look at this object as form and function at work, working, you say, and your experience of that can be depending on your behavior with regard to that form, and your behavior has a form. So the form that we speak of and that G. Spencer Brown is trying to get to the bottom of is this fundamental idea of a distinction. And that we see that we can study the visual system, how we make distinction. We have Gestalt theory to tell us when a line might be extended and so forth and so on, built into our visual system, which is primarily bifurcated into peripheral vision, right? Chapman's sort of zone of safety, my navigation within the world, and focal vision, which allows us to see fidelity, see detail, see fine detail. And it's the combination of these two. So often we're presented with these binary differences between this and that, A and B. We too much focus on those two objects, those two things, the thing, rather than our behavior amongst the consummation that results from our navigation within these things. So, but we're very focused on thingness and thinking about things and appliances and so forth and so on. But the betweenness is where we're actually operating. So we're operating between these things that we identify in the landscape. You know, is it a saber-toothed tiger? Is kind of what's going on behind brain, in the brain, with this part of your vision. I see motion, I detect motion, something's coming at me. So we have very primitive elements of our brain that are working with us all the time. And what we're doing and have done to ourselves, I would imagine, is created a load on our nervous system that requires us to make judgments about so many more things. There's so much difference, there's so much variation, there's so much uncertainty about things. We're constantly put in a mode of being vigilant just to stay alive. Never mind find a good meal. Right? So when we think about the processes we go through, it is a lot of subconscious decision making happening, acclimatization to your context, culturalization in particular ways of how to behave, what to do, and what to think about it. But the atomic level, I guess, is what we're getting at here. Is sort of is there a subatomic level to this atomic level of looking at form itself, which is the atom with which a distinction begins to emerge. And that happens in our perception, right? We get sensations, but somewhere between the sensations we're receiving, aggregate bars which are also happening in parallel. There's a moment of the beginning of the emergent perception. We're emerging from pure sensation into perceptual territory. And Marshall McLuhan famously would say, I don't study concepts, it's too far down the road. I study percepts. And the percepts are the point of origin of things that turn into concepts as we confirm what they may or may not be, right? So the indication is the thing we seize upon. We seize upon the indication, in this case, an abstract notational technique. Just the way you sketch when you're drawing something, it'll become a very complex piece of machinery. You start by drawing a very crude map of the input, the output, the process, and so forth is involved in it. Those we use distinction on distinctions, nested in a way infinitely, and probably fractally in terms of its being self-similar as it scales, right, into the complexity of what we just had in this room to think about. So to me, the thing that fascinated me from the beginning with this, and I stumbled my way through as much of the book as I could to grasp, one, that it's extensible. The concept itself is extensible beyond the notational technique being used, because it's meant to be a provocation. Mark is a thing, and it's meant to provoke a new way of thinking about distinction and things. So in that sense, it's an abstract symbol, and it functions the way most abstract symbols work in mathematics.
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, what you're saying is, as we were talking about gray areas, instead of thinking of this distinction as a distinction between the outside and the inside of the circle, what if we think about the actual circle itself? Is in essence what he's now doing with these marks. So these marks, he says you can combine them. You can, if you have them nested one inside of another, you can cancel them out, almost like a double negation situation. And then he goes into like all these crazy examples of ways you can combine complex marks into simpler notation. He uses these marks to then like not formalize. 2, 3, so on. And I mean, you can even do calculations with them, right? In this example, this first one is 0, 1, 2, 3, so on. I mean, like if you square 2, you still get the new notation for 4. If you add them together, the notation still works. It's like a complete system. But in the book, he says, the space is severed or taken apart. By tracing the way we represent such a severance, we can begin to reconstruct with an accuracy and coverage that appears almost uncanny. Basic forms underlying linguistic, mathematical, physical, and biological science, and can begin to see how the familiar laws of our own experience follow inexorably from the original act of severance. I still need to watch season 2 of that show, by the way. Don't tell me what's happening. But his whole idea of using a breaking of an area as an actual thing still kind of frustrates me almost. Does that make sense? I mean, well, it seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, I think of it as a technique for changing how we think. It's to change our bad habits. I think Adorno was trying to do that for all aesthetics philosophers, sort of help change their mind. And so if we approach form in the traditional classical sense, say in the School of Art or sculpture course, you could say you can make a sculpture by adding things to something, or you can get a block of stone and you take away everything that's not the statue. So this
The wooden log,
what's that?
Wooden log that you sculpt away.
Yeah,
Like you have a chunk of wood and you sculpt away.
everything except what's the guitar, right, at the end of the day. So you've removed everything that's not the guitar you're making out of wood. So this is a kind of simplistic view of the world. We're working on material informs your shaping of that material. What kind of symbols are you using? what I thought was important is to begin to think more carefully about form in a more atomic level, subatomic level. Not only that, because of what the advances in physics had to do, the subatomic particle physics and quantum theory had to do eventually with how our minds actually work. Think about the idea that perception, if you use this as a thought construct to say perception may be a form of entanglement. There's a lot of new work being done in physics around what perception and consciousness are. Right? What is beyond our nervous system, right? What is it we're operating on that we don't know about? So you can think of your nervous system and your sensibilities as limited, quite limited with regard to what's available in the information of the world. It's also a process by which we discard, we throw away. So it's metabolic in that sense. Your mind is more like a metabolic fission, fusion, and reactor. It does both. Eats and collaborates both. So it doesn't buy into couplets. There is no right brain, left brain. That's an old idea of the brain. Much more equivalent to what Adorno was describing in terms of our sensibilities function. So I think it's prudent to have a look both inward and sort of down to the microscopic and beyond the telescopic and microscopic views of form to properly frame a new approach to form that's not about consumption, but about consummation, and not about function so much as fruition. So if we shift from the model of modern design model of form and function, design brief that has a problem and a solution, we have to move out of that construct entirely to deal with reality in a way that's being revealed to us through science. Various sciences are revealing the world in different ways. And we don't have the tools with which to annotate, so to speak, the imaginations of your mind as you work with form, especially as your generation, works with form that's invisible. It's moving out of being manifest visibly. You have notation, and it's moving into the black box. So the methods, the procedures, the processes, whatever, are being codified, algorithmically placed within a machine, and are now no longer visible to us. We don't know what's going on in the machine. We can't even draw distinctions within that black box. So the question is, what are we actually working in? We work with our minds, we're doing thinking. Well, we're deriving all of that from experience. So in some ways, experience design is a culmination of a long period of time. We've been focused on things and objects and material goods, iron, bronze, copper, wood, all those materials, silicon, chips, plastic, and so forth and so on, have preoccupied us most of the time. And oblivious to the fact that we're extracting materials that have finite sources, right? So that's a huge shift in thinking about how to approach design. It moves from including aesthetic transformation of how to think about aesthetics, not as some kind of index to beauty at all, to think about how aesthetics is a component or a way and register within which we can examine how we are experiencing life. And what is a good life? What is a bad life? And so forth and so on. So I think that's sort of the impetus for me to draw philosophers into our discussion as designers to make sure we're not treading on rocky ground, like soft ground, that we have some foundation to our approaches to thinking about form going forward, where so much of what's going to be generated parametrically or administratively and procedurally within a machine is suddenly something that's either our partner or our competitor as a human being. What is it we can do about that? And so one of my suggestions with Simon in talking about this in one of our conversations was we designers lack a notational technique. Teach notational techniques. We lack the notational techniques to talk about what we're really actually talking about. Talk about what we're thinking about, or show what we're actually thinking about. And I mentioned yesterday Victor's work on a medium for thinking about the unthinkable, which he said, you need to see the behavior You need to see the whole behavior. You need to interact with behavior. You need to change the inputs and outputs to the system within which behavior is occurring. And since we're talking about form and function in a behavioral point of view, practically, we talk in Dewey's terms, the practical nature of getting through the day. Aesthetics becomes an even more important tool. And the idea of having a notational style is consistent with also sort of the lack of a language, a lack of a proper language with which to talk about design. If botanists have a much more beautiful language for talking about form than designers do. You go to botany and the way Linnaeus describes your classification and distribution of plants by their visible apparent features, there's a taxonomy there. And Gioia and I have talked about a taxonomy of form from time to time. Whether or not we like that taxonomy as an idea or not, we're not sure yet. But some idea of a taxonomy of form that would allow us to have conversations about form that's not visible, or not tangible. Can't find the pain points in it, so to speak. So this led me to thinking about this with Simon is think as a notational style, what are the other ways, maybe Luke Kaufman's that we want to talk a little about topology here, or even the complexity of knot theory, to say these are territories where people have devoted lifetimes to try to understand the nature of form. And through that understanding of the nature of form, to come with better ways to grapple with form as we reconstitute the habitat and our habits to take into consideration new realities world today. So do you want to take us off in a couple of directions that where we can go from here? This is if you treat this as ground zero, where can we go from here? Philosophically speaking, from a math's point of view or mathematical one.
I mean, as you guys have heard, I know nothing of design, so please ask questions. If you think I can help your understanding of design in some tangential way. To briefly go over it, one of the fields of research I looked into was knot theory, which is a form of topology. Again, it involves circles to some extent. Initially, knot theory was something that I believe Niels Bohr used in the 1920s because he thought that's what the structure of an atom was. He thought the higher the atomic number, it was a more complex knot that had more overlappings, more crossings. Obviously, that's nonsense, and our model of that has changed 2 or 3 times since then. It now has applications, I believe, in like how DNA strands interact with each other and overlap. So some sort of biological implications. But knot theory essentially discusses what is a knot, what is not a knot, and what is the unknot, which is a circle. I typically have rubber bands on me because it's a fun way to mess around with knots. So a normal rubber band would be the unknot because there's no knots, but it's still attached. If I were to cut this, tie a knot, and then glue it back together, would it be the same thing as what I initially had? No, that has a knot in it. So this circle could represent the rubber band, and then you could have something. See if I remember how to draw it. Got this kind of thing. Wait. There we go. So that's called a trefoil, which is another kind of knot. But basically, knot theorists have this whole, like you said, language of describing knots through images. Can like create a system where you have multiple knots interacting with each other, forming like a chain or a link of some sort. But I mean, in terms of notation, within knot theory, you have multiple forms of notation. There's not one universal example. Like you can describe knots as functions. So like you can have some function where stay with me here. Like each variable here represents a different aspect of the knot. And they're each unique, but then you can do manipulations to each knot to see if they're different or the same. And that goes back to the idea of distinction that we keep seeing pop up everywhere is in our lives, we want to try and find out if two things are the same or if they're distinct, aka unique. And often we find that they are.
And that's the fundamental function of computation. That's all the computer is doing at the binary level. Negative. Negative. A computer cannot be constructed. It's not constantly self-aware of its consistency or lack. Underneath everything you've been doing and all the machines and devices that you use, fundamental level there, that's what's happening. The difficulty with that proposition is the binary system of black and white, yes and no.
Is that changing with quantum computing?
Absolutely. That changes with quantum computing. It also changes with coming up with new notational styles, not only G. Spencer Brown's indication of a distinction and a form, and a indication and a distinction. But when we talk about knot theory here, as you see some of these drawings, effectively we're using a two-dimensional frame to draw a three-dimensional / four-dimensional concept that's evolving over time. Now, the importance of that is for you to get better mental models. Think about how to represent relationships which are n-dimensional. You have to start doing it. You're no longer pounding pieces of iron into wood, make houses, right? You have a new abundant resource. Complexity, quote, is free, right? But our understanding complexity is extremely expensive. So generating complexity can happen. And Stephen Wolfram demonstrated that with his iteration of the game of life theory. No one had ever played the game more than 100 or 200 steps. Stephen Wolfram was the first person who played the game, this apparently simple game of how does difference occur by running the algorithm 1 million times. By running the algorithm 1 million times, something was revealed which was not predictable from the first 100 or thousands of repetitions of the procedure, the algorithm. So scaling is something beyond that. That was beyond the sort of imagination of some of the brightest people on Earth. Look, the puzzle used to always be in the last page of Scientific Americans. All the brainy people in the world would do that puzzle over and over again. Stephen had the brilliant idea of, why don't I use a computer to do that procedure 1 million times? And there revealed this new kind of new idea about form, how complexity arises from simplicity, not the other way around. Right? There are theories about intelligent life and so on, but all complexity can be derived from the simplest procedure, the simplest method. And so that, I think, that's part of what I saw in the studies, your investigation into the knot theory related to this is now we have signs and symbols. We have abstract notational techniques to free us from thinking the way we always think about these things, the old dead way of thinking about the material world and how we shape it to make it a better place to live. We have to think about the relationships which are n-dimensional, very difficult to even comprehend when we talk about bigger problems or complex situations. Right? And the complexity and uncertainty level in the world is actually increasing. It's just kind of a common sense. You take the idiosyncrasies of the human species and its ability to use language. Billion is kind of like what Stephen Wolfram did. Instead of 30 people trying to find a way to get a meal on a given day, you have 8.3 billion people trying to do more than all of that in their completely unique and idiosyncratic ways. You've exploded the exponentiality of what human experience can be. Therefore, no wonder it's very difficult to understand the other because there are at least 8 billion of them. but never mention the species, other species we live on Earth with. So we are dealing with issues for which we have no computational capacity in our own sensory systems. So we must deal with these things in the abstract, right? We must come up with better abstractions to represent the nature of what we're studying. And that will always bring us back to aesthetics. It will always bring us back to that tool with which we make judgments about the world. Do I do what I habitually do? Do I do this weird little impulse I have right now? Right. We was facing that all the time. Or do I invoke intelligence? And what is intelligence from a Jungian point of view? That's a very quick way to say it. So that's what I see off. Do you want to talk a little about Luke Kaufman or no
Yeah,
today?
Please.
Yes.
Actually, I was thinking about if aesthetics and how aesthetics can help designers face complexity. I don't know if there's an answer, but what are your thoughts on that?
Like yesterday you mentioned something like that, I think.
Conversation.
Conversation. I think we're doing it to discuss. And of course, it's not going to be determined, but to draw a line at some point and at least try and do something, but it's a rather imperceptible. And we need to really get to the discussing in interdisciplinary environments. So you maybe need someone who nudges the discussion a little bit towards the question that you are talking, the point is, and we need to bring together. Not a simple effort, but we're dealing with complexity here. And I think that would be a very, if we had some complex way.
Yeah, it could move the design discourse away from the traditional critique of design. Pain points, do I like it, do I not like it? There's a very kind of rudimentary, almost kind of a childish approach to talking about form. To elevate the discussion about form to a conversation, collective conversation about form, where that vocabulary, those concepts, those considerations are always a part of it. They're not tacked on at the end. That's what happened. The distinction between utility and beauty over the 19th and 20th century, we just sort of, it was ugly, but it worked. So let's wrap it in something, right? And so much of the internet is also quite ugly, but it's been wrapped, luxuriously wrapped in kind of luxury consumption mode. So we all just kind of accept it. We made banking easy, fun, and friendly. Now you have no money.
I know.
And so sorry about that. So, you know, so the standard vocabulary which we talk about that needs to be injected by what I advocate for of aesthetics in a very rigorous way, in a totally new sense of the word itself. Move completely away from the idea that it's some kind of beauty contest. That has to do with everything we experience, how we experience it, and that the conversation, therefore, I would say, requires not only signs and symbols to support the conversation, document what's happening in real time, but the language, the speaking of. Right? And the line I would keep remembering was Wittgenstein's line at the end of Juxtaposes, where he says, "Whereof one may not speak, thereof one must be silent." In other words, we run out of space within which words actually work for us if we don't invoke also the symbols of the visible world, the intangible world, the things for which we do not have words. Right? So it's a combination of the language and these forms, right? Notational forms, which allow us to have the proper conversation, what we think we're trying to do.
It's not
And-
just
yeah.
talking about discussing, but it's also,
Yeah.
enacting.
Enacting it, making it happen.
But it's not a question, but it's like when someone asks me of what is a designer, I use an essay to answer, written by Tomás Maldonado, that's one of the founders of the design school in Milano. And in this essay, It talks about Robinson Crusoe, you know, the guy, the shipwrecked on an island alone. And Maldonado describes, you know, the attitude of that guy as a project maker. So he was definitely a maker. He made a lot of things. But the way Maldonado describes this projecting attitude, I think is, that's what I used to say, that's not a designer. So, because he says, you know, Robinson doesn't design or project for others, but only for himself. He has only one problem, is to survive. Robinson is above all a problem solver. That's what he is. Only what is convenient is pertinent, and his obsession is, in final analysis, always utility. Maybe that's functionalism. Never seeks a cultural legitimation for the objects he produces. Then there is no place, no time for any premises based on values of any kind. And you know, he believes in God, but this doesn't seem to affect his way of thinking about project activity, decidedly oriented towards utility and absolutely indifferent to ethical and aesthetic judgments. So hence, for me, he's not a designer.
I would question whether he wasn't burdened by everything that he brought to the island from his upbringing, his culture. I mean, to me, that's a heavy burden to bring into an island. Different case would be sort of the raised by wolves human experience, where someone has been abandoned in infancy and grows in the wild. Even then, they are learning a culture, learning a language, even the language of making. So I don't know if the distinction matters, whether someone's to define it. In some respects, I say, you know, I think Herbert Muschamp said this, who said he was an architect, he was an architecture critic for the New York Times, who said, call myself as a designer as a mere conceit. It's something I can call myself. Whether you are or not, a good one, a bad one, what have you, that all remains to be seen. But it's a matter of sort of intentionally anointing yourself, sort of as thinking in that mode and having that state of mind. That said, the architect that I admire most these days is actually a chair of architecture at ETH in Zurich, Jan the Builder, who calls himself not the chair of architecture, but the chair of attitude. Because he realizes that that is what is needed more than anything else, is a complete change of attitude. So it's what I'm proposing is your attitude toward these notations, these abstruse languages that are difficult to penetrate, your attitude toward those needs to be enlarged and extended into, you know, to include these considerations of what you actually deal with every day, right? As well as the philosophical considerations that come not only from aesthetics, but the whole range of philosophies, including ethics, I'm a part of considerations, the language. So yeah, at the end of the day, do you end up being a designer or not? One way to test it is if you ever got paid for doing it. So if you never got paid for doing it, you're just a poet.
I mean, to me, it's just this absence of ethic and aesthetic judgment. That's what makes a difference.
Yeah. So you got
To me, if I'm designing for myself, just within the most utilitarian, and I do not consider myself a designer. But I don't know, maybe I don't know why I need that distinction.
Yourself.
It's just an attitude. Everybody designs, of course. Everybody. But what is then the difference between a professional designer and an attitude that
That's me, that's a commercial distinction. If you're being paid to do it, you're professional by definition.
It's a matter of degree again, right? But I love that long definition of design or a designer. And
Well, it doesn't say that. It's me saying.
Yeah, you're-
It's just
you're-
proposing
you're-
different.
no, I love it. Even because I think it proves how, designing or being able to, solve a problem, but also to set a problem, because there is a dynamics there too. It's not just about survival. It's about living fully not just surviving and again efficiently, go on to the next thing to do. So I think there's a rich way of understanding what it is to design, and both as a professional designer, because let's be honest, there are some people who are more gifted than us. Not us. I'm talking about myself. As I was saying here yesterday, I cannot even draw a straight line, so I'm not gifted at all in that sense. So there are people who can do things better, but it's always a matter of reading. So you can
Yeah, I
learn
mean,
as
it
well.
has practical implication, because if we believe that there is this ethical and aesthetical judgments make a difference, then I need to teach students how to make that judgment. So maybe I need to introduce ethics and aesthetics as part of design education, because that what distinguish an amateur designer, as Manzini says in Everybody Designs in a book, from a professional designer. Because
Especially with a more complete understanding of what aesthetics is and does for us. You have a question?
there was another one pending question.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I was wondering about how you made the distinction between Western and non-Western philosophy, and I'm wondering, had sort of maybe texts or references for what those non-Western philosophies are, because a lot of what you were talking about, I also read Dewey in class, but just from like my personal life, a lot of like the quotes that you highlighted from Dewey and reminded me of like Filipino philosophy, which we use the word like diwa, which essentially means like the spirit of something. So it kind of encompasses exactly what you're talking about, the spectrum and function, all the kind of other things. But I was just wondering if there are other non-Western philosophies.
When I refer to this distinction, Western and non-Western, I refer to the fact that the need to gain something aesthetics or even fine arts, system of fine arts, and both happened at the same time in the Western world. It was just a need that the Western world had. The rest of the world was absolutely fine with keeping everything together on the same plane, basically. So mainstream aesthetics has been for a long time this Western aesthetics concerned with certain things and with a certain, two things. As far as non-Western aesthetics are concerned, I would certainly recommend Yuriko Sato's aesthetics. She's a Japanese, she's in America at Rhode Island School of Design, so she's actually quite close. She wrote many essays, and she's the editor-in-chief of Contemporary Aesthetics, which is an open access journal. So I recommend to check that because it's a very inclusive venue and arena of discussion for aesthetics and everyday aesthetics specifically. She wrote basically what I call a trilogy of on aesthetics, where she integrates non-Western perspectives, feminist perspectives on aesthetics, which are everyday aesthetics, 2007, aesthetics of the familiar, 2017, and aesthetics of care, which is absolutely interesting from 2022, I think. And so there's this Japanese import, let's say, to the discourse that she brings to the table. And then there's also another book on everyday aesthetics called, I think, The Play of Culture and something else, I don't remember, I'm sorry, by Katia Mandoki. She's a Mexican scholar, and she published this book on everyday aesthetics in the same year as Saito, but didn't have the same success she had. But I think these, and then there's a whole lot of production in literature in the field of Chinese aesthetics. I don't have specific names, but if you just type something, you find a whole lot of things. And I would recommend also Thomas Leddy, The Extraordinary in the Ordinary, from 2012, where he also sort of goes through the evolution of everyday aesthetics. So he also mentions non-Western perspective on aesthetics. So maybe you can have, some references there. be interesting. But if you want, just email me, do a lot of research.
That's another distinction, Western, not Western.
Which nowadays it's perhaps because, you know, we don't really have, no longer have this mainstream aesthetics. I mean, we still have, you know, old, the residual, you know, ways of dealing with aesthetics, which still think about vision, contemplation, objects, properties, and this is the analytical tradition of aesthetics, which has surfaced around the 50s, 60s of the 20th century and has completely sort of covered the pragmatist and phenomenological perspective on aesthetics, which were forming. Sort of trying to keep together the complexity of things, and hence were considered as murky, not clear enough, and hence analytical aesthetics. But even though we have these vestiges or residues from this kind of approach, I'd say that aesthetics is rather, you know, inclusive and
More comprehensive.
more comprehensive. Absolutely.
Your question?
Yeah, I had two questions. The first one is, does that kind of help me understand this distinction and framework, but what is actually in our design processes and how it would kind of change what we do. And my second question, kind of piggybacking off of that, is that you mentioned briefly that discussion is a big part of how we should start changing and shifting our frameworks. And like how creating language is essential to abstracting and understanding these concepts better. I also understand that sometimes creating language can become an exclusive thing where only the few people who are involved in what's going on. Does that mean that we are continuously creating new language every single time we have a new experience, design experience? And yeah, that seems like a lot. And how do we kind of navigate that?
Yeah, what is the new practice and how does it get propagated? And who's included in that practice? And it's like a form of literacy. In other words, we could conduct this session in Italian actually today, and some of us would be left behind. So it is very much about language, right? And languaging, as the phrase has become. That another form of that would be Jerome Letvin's, who wrote part of the thing. He was it's part of the team that wrote What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. Very fundamental scientific investigation. Who referred to his work as he referred to himself as an experimental epistemologist. Epistemology is the languaging of the production of language. In other words, to refine and specify language more particularly, to be more precise in use of language, which is a speculative process, which we have to begin by saying something dumb and then trying to fix what we said by making it more specific, more accurate, more precise. And in a cybernetic sense, and second order cybernetics, invoking that is say how to come to agreement on terms. What are the terms? One approach would be to say, well, what are the facts of life and how can we articulate those in an abstract form? Physicists, scientists use notation all the time. Mathematicians, especially physicists, use mathematics or maths to do their work all the time. And that is their language.
I mean, George Spencer Brown literally says mathematics is the science of what we know, of what we have defined. It has no place for opinions or beliefs of any kind.
So that's a very profound statement about the nature of inquiry. Don't bring your beliefs with you, right? Robinson Crusoe had to bring his beliefs with him, right? He didn't have a religion, but he brought all that with him. So this is a very kind of disciplined approach to thinking, right? To think in the abstract and comprehensive, sensitive way, to account for all, to have a model of the sensitivities, not just a model of the functionalities, but what are the sensitivities beyond the function of the model? What are the second and third order consequences of something happening. So now you're making things that make things happen. You're not just making things, you're making things that happen. Would you like those to be good things that happen? That's so the relationship, I call it the relationship of form to fruition. It's a forward-looking sort of lateral view or sort of time-based view of the cascade of consequences that can come from your disruption of the existing form, your first perturbation of the circle, the first knot that you created, right? So you're going to create, you're going to unravel something and then re-knot it. So what you're working with is, say, a garment or a piece of textile that has been ripped. And now the question is, how do you want to repair them? Your world has been ripped asunder. Your world has been disrupted. We live in a world that's highly disruptive, highly violent, and has all kinds of flaws and breakdowns in it, right? They're constantly a part of our everyday experience. Many of those have been smoothed over, like the roads in Boston. They've been smoothed over, except for where they're not. And those represent opportunities for us to do something about it. What was our experience yesterday? What's someone else's experience? The most difficult thing, I think, is this idea of bringing the other, the picture from an aesthetic point of view. How can you possibly channel someone else's experience of something or preemptively think of what that experience might be? They're engineered all the time. Been engineered for us, but air travel is an experience. Been engineered to a certain degree, and it's been accommodated certain kind of needs and desires. But we don't have, and I offer, mathematics and signs and symbols and abstract notational techniques as ways to improve the quality of the conversation we're having about design. We can improve the quality of the conversation we're having about design. And the nature of that conversation is to improve the quality of the question. What is the question before us as we're being designed? You get a design brief, that's the answer already. If someone gives you a design brief, you've been told what the answer is. You're now working within a constraint. It may be economic, it may be resource, it may be skill-based, it may be knowledge constrained. All kinds of various obstructions are in your way to deal with. That keeps you busy and it keeps people pretty satisfied with progress is being made. But that accumulates over time into catastrophe. To next area of inquiry, chaos theory. So think about what it means to think about chaos. So as a designer, you're trying to impose order, you're trying to bring stability, you're trying to resolve questions, you're trying to solve puzzles. But what does it mean to actually contemplate the nature of chaos, entropy, the expansion of energy? We had a Native American in our class a few weeks back who was saying your culture is how you choose to spend your energy. If you think about that, as a designer having intentions toward the world, whose energy spent how and resulting in what effect? So it's more like this design studio for social intervention. It says what we're looking at are, in our process, we deal with ideas, arrangements, and effects. What about things? We're not designing things. We're working on ideas. What is the idea? What's the question? What's the idea? And so that's where philosophy as well, and techniques of representing the world abstractly better than actually will need to exist, will need to be a part of our nature of our work. So we can focus on those as arrangements, the arrangement of something, right? Composition or arrangement of something with an eye to its effects. And then the effects, the question is, effect on whom? Effect, Paulo figures his day out, he's considering the effects on his own well-being throughout the day that can be very insular. But it partakes of everything else that's been made by all kinds of other people, and to do that. Unless he grows the fabric to make his own clothes and things like that, but totally engaged in direct contact with the existing materials to make your life what you want it to be. Another choice. But designers typically are in a position of acting on the behalf of others it's a kind of service trade, and the desires and interests of most others are broken down between the buyer, the decision maker, and the actual beneficiary. Sometimes they're not the same person. Creates problems.
I thought your question was a little bit about the design process, and what I'm hearing in your response is actually process remains largely the same. It's the areas of effort and inquiry and focus
The thing that remains,
quite different.
the thing that remains the same is the nature of conversation. Cybernetics, being explicit about the fact that you're having a conversation. That's not just a discussion, but they're formalizing and codifying. And you need these notational techniques to codify what's happening in a conversation. Because without the documentation, it evaporates. Right? Everyone remembers it differently. You don't have any documentation that you can refer to. And that's why I often ask people to draw. Simon was drawing freehand in real time because that's using photons to move the information. When we use our computers, or even on the laptop, there's a little bit of lag. And that lag is important. It's a burden on your cognitive process. So the more you can conduct it as a conversation, quite naturally using the language skill, it's amazing ability to use language as philosophers and also as people, semioticians, so to speak, people who invoke systems of signs to complement the words, right? So we can get closer agreement on what we've made, what it is, and more importantly, our decision about it. Right? Now we have to decide. Now we have to choose. I think that's the side of design that gets least treatment because it leads us into the territory where there's a high risk because we haven't had the conversations we need to have. Vigorous your conversation, the more you establish a trust with your clientele. It allows you to have an open, free conversation about things where likely you'll be closer to what people are actually thinking and trying to make happen.
I can give a practical example of how this framework has been particularly useful. My field, data visualization, information design, you know what it is? There's a very specific area for design. When I started working in that area, it was 15, 20 years ago, we were living that opposition. So there was a utilitarian functional way of designing data and information that was and considered to be the right way to do it. It was ornament as crime, embellishment was bad. It was this Taftian, first Tafti way of designing data and information. And it was primarily dominated by scientists, and data analysis was part of computer science back then. On the other side, there were some, media people, infographics, graphic design, doing some sort of, non-orthodox way of designing things. So they were on the other side, like more embellishment, ornament, and there was kind of a fight, a clash. And there was no design involved at all. The reason why design got involved is because it was able to lead the tension between the two. Because of course, there is no pure functional utilitarian data visualization ever. Even most, abstract dashboard can imagine has always a communicative component. Aesthetics is involved in any case. And on the other side, there is no, pure, beautiful data visualization that doesn't have. It came into the beat as part of the game because it was able to play that tension. So that was the designers that started to populate that space. I don't think we did that intentionally, but we were able to fill that space that was in between those two worlds that exist. So maybe that's happening in other fields of design. So that was a practical, even if unconscious way of that framework in action by finding a space that was precisely in between. That's probably where design mostly lives, in between tensions. That's what we maybe are better than others to navigate this tension.
Being comfortable with the uncertainty. Because that's the position you're actually in, it's high degree of uncertainty. Another practical example would be to introduce into your discourse with anything, the point of view of the other explicitly. What are the other points of view? What are the multiple perspectives from those points of view? What are the perceptions that go with those various? So it keeps growing, it gets very complex. We enumerate points of view as points of view and perspectives, that from those points of view, the aesthetic is operating in very different ways than you can even imagine. So a very rigorous way of going through those points of view and being able to not just a use case, but actually seriously think about the range of perceptions available from each perspective at each point of view. That's a very rigorous process. Doing this well is extremely difficult. That's what's happened to design. The easy work is being done by machines because it's procedural algorithmic. You can write a program to do it. That's been happening for the last 50 years, just like that, moving like that. Same time, the number of designers has risen exponentially every 10 years. That means everyone's a designer by now because we all have tools. But what hasn't kept pace is our capacity to represent the things that need to be thought about and discover the things that are unforeseen. Trouble spots, danger areas, things beyond the peripheral vision we don't know of it. That requires a very rigorous attention to perception, and that leads us directly into use of aesthetics as the language within which we can begin to talk about it, especially if we can improve that by adding to the language the symbolic forms that allow us to make more sense than the language in itself. Because the language will also converge on convention. You'll reduce to common practice. That's how we do it. Oh, UI, UX, this is how it's done. You do the customer journey, you do you find the pain point, you identify the problem, and you eliminate them. And you're done. And we have not solved it. We've in fact contributed. I've used the phrase the other day, sort of lubricating consumption. Designers have been lubricating consumption at very high rate, very high velocity. Nobody's fault. That's what's going on. We're just calling attention to that by saying we should go back to some really fundamental principles, look at the basics, do what the physicists are doing, looking at subatomic particles and Higgs boson particles and God particles, and looking at those things and how do they actually function? Especially how do they function with regard to what we call our mind, not a brain. Your mind. You have a brain, but your mind is shared. You only have a mind because of sharing. Otherwise, you don't have a mind. You only have a brain. So that's the territory we want to operate in, and that's where abstraction is so powerful. By teaching children to think in the abstract is so powerful, and Treille discovered that in the mid-1800s. That abstraction is a human thinking skill. It doesn't come naturally. You need to learn how to think abstract. Problem with media we have today is we distribute media in all this full fidelity of color and glory and action videos for toddlers to look at on their screens, where we should be given them a set of toothpicks to play with. We can start thinking in the abstract. We've lost that. So the designer's ability to think comprehensively in the abstract is the thing we lack. So that's what we're hoping this begins, this process of thinking not only symbolic form, but language.
So with that goal in mind,
Yeah.
I think we can wrap up the session with.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lots of.
Thanks.